The first intelligence briefing arrived at Langley at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning in September. The encrypted message from Station Chief Marcus Webb in Ouagadougou contained just 12 words that would set in motion the most ambitious covert operation in West Africa since the Cold War. Traoré consolidating power rapidly. Window for intervention closing. Recommend immediate action. Director Sarah Mitchell read the cable 3 times before reaching for her secure phone. Within 6 hours, she was sitting across from Deputy Secretary of State James Harrison in a windowless conference room deep beneath the Pentagon. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the classified documents spread between them. "The President wants options," Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of orders that had come directly from the Oval Office. Traoré's alignment with Russia and his anti-Western rhetoric are destabilizing the entire Sahel region. "Our military bases, our mining interests, our strategic partnerships with neighboring countries, everything is at risk." Mitchell nodded grimly. She had been tracking Ibrahim Traoré's rise for months, watching as the young military leader consolidated his grip on Burkina Faso with alarming efficiency. His public speeches denounced Western influence while embracing closer ties with Moscow. French troops had been expelled. American advisors were being systematically marginalized. The domino effect across West Africa was already beginning. "What kind of options are we talking about?" Mitchell asked, though she already suspected the answer. Harrison slid a manila folder across the table. The red classification stamp read, "Eyes Only, Operation Sahel Storm." 3 weeks later, Captain David Reynolds sat in a nondescript café in Accra, Ghana, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and watching the bustling street outside. To any observer, he appeared to be just another American businessman killing time between meetings. His cover story was solid: agricultural equipment sales throughout West Africa. His real mission was far more complex. Reynolds had spent 15 years in Army Special Operations before transitioning to the CIA's Special Activities Division. He had orchestrated regime changes in 3 countries, each operation so seamless that the international community never suspected American involvement. But this assignment felt different. More dangerous. More personal. The intelligence package on Traoré painted a picture of a man who was both idealistic and ruthless, beloved by his people yet increasingly isolated on the international stage. He had survived 2 previous coup attempts, each time emerging stronger and more suspicious of foreign influence. Getting close to him would require finesse, patience, and a considerable amount of luck. Reynolds's encrypted phone buzzed with a text message that appeared to be about fertilizer shipments but actually contained his first set of operational orders. Phase 1 was beginning. Back in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, gazing out at the city he now controlled. The weight of leadership pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. At 34, he had never expected to find himself at the center of a continental struggle between global superpowers. His aide, Colonel Amadou Sankara, approached with the evening intelligence briefing. "Excellence, our sources in Ghana report increased American diplomatic activity. There are also reports of unusual movement among expatriate communities in neighboring countries." Traoré turned from the balcony, his expression hardening. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" "It appears so, Excellence. Our Russian advisors have provided additional intelligence suggesting a coordinated Western response to our recent policy shifts." The irony was not lost on Traoré. In seeking to free his country from Western influence, he had potentially triggered the very intervention he sought to prevent. But that was only the beginning of his troubles. 3 days later, Drive. Elena Vasquez arrived in Ouagadougou under the cover of a World Health Organization mission to assess vaccination programs in rural areas. Her credentials were impeccable, her Spanish passport genuine, and her medical expertise real. What the immigration officials who stamped her entry visa didn't know was that she had spent the previous 5 years working for the CIA's Technical Services Division, specializing in biological and chemical operations. Her mission was elegantly simple in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. She was to establish contact with Traoré's inner circle through legitimate medical channels, gain access to the presidential compound, and create an opportunity for what the operation planners euphemistically called executive action. Dr. Vasquez had volunteered for the assignment, driven by a combination of professional ambition and genuine belief that Traoré's alignment with Russia posed a threat to regional stability. She had studied his speeches, his background, his family history. She knew that he had lost both parents to preventable diseases, which had driven his interest in improving his country's healthcare system. That knowledge would become her way in. Meanwhile, Reynolds had crossed the border from Ghana and was now operating out of a safe house in Bobo Dioulasso, Burkina Faso's second-largest city. His cover as an agricultural equipment salesman allowed him to move freely throughout the country, establishing contacts with local farmers and businessmen while quietly mapping the security arrangements around key government facilities. His real breakthrough came through an unexpected source, a mechanic named Musa who serviced vehicles for the presidential motorcade. Musa was deeply in debt due to his daughter's medical expenses, and Reynolds saw an opportunity that could benefit everyone involved. "I represent certain international interests," Reynolds explained during their third meeting in Musa's cramped workshop. "We're concerned about the direction your country is heading. We believe change is necessary." Musa's hands trembled as he wiped grease from a wrench. "You're talking about treason." "I'm talking about salvation," Reynolds replied calmly. "Your daughter needs surgery that costs more than you'll make in 5 years. We can arrange for her to receive the best medical care in Europe, completely free of charge. All we need in return is information about schedules, routes, security procedures." The moral weight of the decision was crushing, but Musa thought of his daughter's face, pale and thin from months of illness. He nodded slowly, sealing a bargain that would change the course of history. No one expected what came next. Dr. Vasquez's medical credentials opened doors that would have remained closed to traditional intelligence operatives. Within 2 weeks of her arrival, she had gained access to the presidential compound to brief Traoré's staff on a potential cholera outbreak in the northern provinces. The meeting was routine, professional, and provided her with detailed knowledge of the compound's layout, security procedures, and daily routines. She reported back to Langley through an encrypted satellite communications system hidden in her medical equipment. The response was immediate and chilling: green light for Phase 2. Asset authorization confirmed. But Traoré's intelligence network was more sophisticated than the Americans had anticipated. Colonel Sankara had been tracking unusual patterns in foreign arrivals, communications intercepts, and behavioral changes among palace staff. The presence of both Reynolds and Dr. Vasquez had not gone unnoticed. "Excellence," Sankara said during their morning briefing, "I believe we have a problem." Traoré listened as his intelligence chief outlined the evidence, circumstantial but compelling. The Spanish doctor who had arrived with impeccable credentials but whose background contained subtle inconsistencies. The American businessman whose agricultural equipment samples didn't match the specifications he claimed to represent. The mechanic whose financial situation had suddenly improved despite no apparent change in his business. "How certain are you?" Traoré asked. 70%, Excellence. But given the stakes, I believe we should act on this intelligence. That afternoon, Moussa received an unexpected visit from the National Intelligence Service. The interrogation was thorough but not brutal. Traoré had given specific orders that information was to be extracted through psychological pressure rather than physical coercion. Within 6 hours, Moussa had revealed everything he knew about Reynolds and the operation. But the Americans had anticipated this possibility. Reynolds was already gone by the time security forces raided his safe house in Bobo Dioulasso. His extraction had been planned for weeks, with multiple escape routes and contingency plans. What he left behind, however, was a sophisticated electronic surveillance system that continued to feed intelligence back to Langley even after his departure. Dr. Vasquez's situation was more precarious. Her medical cover was deeper and more complex, making immediate extraction difficult without exposing the entire operation. She received coded instructions through her WHO communication channels: maintain cover, continue mission, prepare for emergency extraction if necessary. She never got the chance to follow those orders. The knock on her hotel room door came at 0230 hours. Colonel Sankara stood in the hallway with 4 members of the Presidential Guard, their faces professionally neutral but their intentions unmistakable. "Dr. Vasquez, President Traoré would like to speak with you." The drive to the presidential compound took place in complete silence. Dr. Vasquez's mind raced through her training, her cover story, her emergency protocols. She had been in dangerous situations before, but never with stakes this high and extraction possibilities this limited. Traoré received her in his private office, a spartanly furnished room that reflected his military background. He gestured for her to sit across from his desk, then studied her with the intense gaze of a man accustomed to reading people's intentions through their expressions. "Dr. Vasquez," he began, his English accented but precise, "I want to thank you for your concern about the cholera situation in our northern provinces. Your expertise has been valuable." She maintained her composure, falling back on her medical credentials. "It's my pleasure, Mr. President. Public health challenges don't recognize national boundaries." "Indeed they don't," Traoré agreed. "Much like political influences, wouldn't you say?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Dr. Vasquez felt her heart rate increase but kept her expression neutral. "I'm not sure I understand, Mr. President." Traoré leaned forward slightly. "I think you understand perfectly. The question is whether you're willing to admit it." What followed was a conversation that would be analyzed by intelligence professionals for years to come. Traoré didn't accuse her directly or present evidence of her real mission. Instead, he spoke about the challenges facing his country, the pressure from foreign powers, and his determination to chart an independent course for Burkina Faso. "You see, Doctor, I know that powerful nations view leaders like me as problems to be solved rather than partners to be respected. I understand that my policies, my alliances, my very existence may be seen as threats to interests far beyond our borders." Dr. Vasquez listened, recognizing both the intelligence and the pain in his words. This was not the caricature of a dictator that had been presented in her briefing materials. This was a man genuinely trying to navigate impossible circumstances while protecting his people's sovereignty. But what these powerful nations fail to understand, Traoré continued, is that we are not alone. We have allies, intelligence networks, and capabilities that may surprise them. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Dr. Vasquez, I'm going to give you a choice. You can continue with whatever mission brought you here, in which case I will be forced to treat you as a hostile agent. Or you can leave my country immediately and report back to your handlers that Ibrahim Traoré is not as vulnerable as they believe. The next 12 hours would prove to be the longest of Dr. Vasquez's career. She was escorted back to her hotel under discreet surveillance and given until the following evening to make her decision. Her encrypted communications with Langley revealed the full scope of the crisis. Their primary asset was compromised, their operation exposed, and their target fully aware of American intentions. Director Mitchell's response was swift and decisive: abort mission. Extract asset immediately. Initiate diplomatic cover protocol. But Traoré had one more surprise in store. The following morning, Vasquez received an invitation to attend a press conference at the presidential palace. When she arrived, she found herself in a room filled with international journalists, diplomats, and government officials. Traoré took the podium with the confidence of a man holding all the cards. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want to address certain allegations that have come to my attention regarding foreign interference in our nation's affairs." What followed was a masterclass in political theater. Without mentioning Vasquez by name or directly accusing the United States government, Traoré revealed enough details about the operation to make it clear that he knew exactly what had been planned. He spoke about sovereignty, dignity, and the right of African nations to choose their own path without external coercion. "We will not be intimidated," he declared. "We will not be destabilized. And we will not allow our people to become pawns in the strategic games of global superpowers." The international reaction was swift and embarrassing for the United States. While no official acknowledgement was made of Operation Sahel Storm, diplomatic channels buzzed with speculation and recrimination. The operation had not just failed, it had been turned into a public relations victory for the very leader it was designed to remove. Dr. Vasquez was quietly extracted that evening through an emergency protocol that involved a medical evacuation flight supposedly transporting a critically ill Spanish national. She would spend the next 6 months in debriefing sessions, trying to understand how such a carefully planned operation had unraveled so completely. The answer, as she would eventually learn, lay in the sophisticated intelligence network that Russia had helped Traoré establish in the months following his rise to power. Every American move had been anticipated, every asset identified, every communication intercepted. The operation had been doomed from the moment it began. But the failure of Operation Sahel Storm was more than just an intelligence setback. It marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power in West Africa. Traoré's successful exposure of American interference enhanced his credibility throughout the region and accelerated the process of Western military withdrawals that he had been advocating. 6 months later, Director Mitchell sat in the same Pentagon conference room where the operation had been authorized, reading the after-action report that would effectively end her career. The investigation had revealed not just operational failures but fundamental misunderstandings about the political dynamics in West Africa and the capabilities of leaders like Traoré. "How did we get it so wrong?" Deputy Secretary Harrison asked, his own position now under scrutiny. Mitchell closed the classified report and met his gaze. We underestimated him. We assumed that because he was young and came from a small African country, he would be easy to manipulate or remove. We forgot that intelligence, determination, and popular support can be more powerful than all our technological advantages. The conversation was interrupted by an aide who handed Harrison an urgent intelligence brief. His face darkened as he read the contents. "What now?" Mitchell asked. Traoré just announced a new military cooperation agreement with Russia. They're establishing a permanent base in Burkina Faso, and 3 neighboring countries have expressed interest in similar arrangements. Mitchell felt a familiar weight settle in her stomach. The operation designed to prevent Russian expansion in West Africa had instead accelerated it. The domino effect they had feared was now occurring, but in the opposite direction from what they had intended. In Ouagadougou, Traoré stood once again on the presidential palace balcony, but this time he was not alone. Colonel Sankara joined him, along with General Petrov, the newly appointed Russian military advisor whose presence symbolized the shifting geopolitical landscape. "Excellence," Sankara said, "the intelligence reports suggest that the Americans may be planning additional operations against other leaders in the region." Traoré nodded thoughtfully. "Then we must ensure that our neighbors are prepared. The network we've built here can be replicated elsewhere." General Petrov smiled slightly. "My government is very pleased with how you handled the situation, Mr. President. Your approach has been educational for other regional leaders." What none of them mentioned, but all understood, was that the failed American operation had accomplished something that years of diplomatic efforts had not. It had provided concrete proof of Western interference that could be used to justify closer ties with Russia and other non-Western powers. The irony was not lost on any of them. 2 years later, Captain Reynolds sat in a bar in Arlington, Virginia, nursing a whiskey and reflecting on the operation that had effectively ended his career in covert operations. The official record stated that he had performed admirably under difficult circumstances, but everyone involved knew that Operation Sahel Storm had been a disaster from which American influence in West Africa had never recovered. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Burkina Faso President Traoré announces African Defense Alliance with 6 nations. The accompanying photo showed Traoré at a signing ceremony in Ouagadougou, surrounded by other West African leaders who had followed his model of expelling Western forces while embracing Russian support. Reynolds finished his drink and wondered if history would judge them as incompetent operatives or simply as representatives of a declining empire that had lost touch with the changing realities of a multipolar world. Dr. Vasquez had reached a different conclusion during her own period of reflection. Now working as a legitimate public health consultant, she often thought about her conversation with Traoré in his office. She had expected to find a dictator motivated by power and corruption. Instead, she had encountered a leader genuinely trying to navigate the impossible pressures of global geopolitics while serving his people's interests. The realization had forced her to question not just the specific operation she had been part of, but the entire framework of assumptions that guided American foreign policy in Africa. Were leaders like Traoré really threats to be eliminated, or were they symptoms of legitimate grievances that needed to be addressed through diplomacy rather than covert action? Her final report to the CIA had included recommendations for a fundamental shift in approach, from regime change operations to genuine partnership and development assistance. The recommendations had been filed and forgotten, but she took some comfort in knowing that she had at least tried to learn from the failure. Meanwhile, In Moscow, the success of the Burkina Faso operation had become a case study in asymmetric geopolitical strategy. Russian intelligence services analyzed every aspect of how they had identified and countered the American operation, developing protocols that could be applied in similar situations around the world. The lesson was clear: in an era of declining American hegemony, relatively small investments in intelligence sharing and military cooperation could yield enormous strategic dividends. The cost of supporting Traoré had been minimal compared to the value of establishing a Russian foothold in West Africa and demonstrating American vulnerability. But the real winners in this geopolitical chess match were not the Russians or the Americans. They were leaders like Traoré who had successfully navigated between competing global powers while maintaining their independence and serving their people's interests. As the third anniversary of Operation Sahel Storm approached, Traoré reflected on the lessons learned during those dangerous months. The experience had taught him that true sovereignty required not just political independence but also intelligence capabilities, economic diversification, and military preparedness. He had also learned that the global balance of power was shifting in ways that created opportunities for smaller nations to assert greater independence. The key was understanding how to leverage these changes while avoiding the fate of leaders who had miscalculated and paid the ultimate price. The failed American operation had been a wake-up call, but it had also been an opportunity. By successfully exposing and countering it, Traoré had established his credibility as a leader who could not be easily intimidated or removed. This credibility had become the foundation for everything that followed: the regional alliances, the economic partnerships, the military cooperation agreements that had transformed West Africa's geopolitical landscape. Standing on the familiar balcony of the presidential palace, Traoré watched the sun set over Ouagadougou and contemplated the challenges that lay ahead. The Americans would not give up easily, and there would undoubtedly be future attempts to undermine his government and reverse the changes he had implemented. But he was no longer the isolated young leader who had first faced the prospect of foreign intervention. He now had allies, intelligence networks, and defensive capabilities that would make any future operations far more difficult and dangerous for those who might attempt them. The game had changed, and Ibrahim Traoré had proven that he knew how to play it. Colonel Sankara joined him on the balcony, carrying the evening intelligence briefing that had become a routine part of their daily schedule. "Any immediate concerns?" Traoré asked. "Nothing urgent, Excellence. Our sources continue to monitor American diplomatic activity in the region, but there are no indications of immediate operational planning. The French appear to be reassessing their entire West African strategy. The Chinese are expressing interest in expanded economic cooperation." Traoré nodded, processing the information. "And our regional partners?" "All stable, Excellence. The defense alliance is functioning well, and intelligence sharing has prevented 2 potential coup attempts in member countries over the past 6 months. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an aide with an encrypted message from an unexpected source: Drive. Elena Vázquez, the former CIA operative who had tried to infiltrate his government years earlier. The message was brief but intriguing: Mr. President, I hope this communication finds you well. I wanted you to know that your approach to sovereignty and development has been studied and admired by many in the international community. I hope we might have the opportunity to discuss legitimate cooperation in the future. Traoré smiled slightly. The world was indeed changing in ways that few had anticipated. 5 years after Operation Sahel Storm, the geopolitical landscape of West Africa bore little resemblance to what American planners had envisioned when they authorized the covert operation. Instead of a compliant client state aligned with Western interests, Burkina Faso had become the center of a new axis of African independence that challenged the entire post-colonial framework. The domino effect that American policymakers had feared was indeed occurring, but not in the way they had expected. Rather than falling to external manipulation, African leaders were learning from Traoré's example and developing their own strategies for maintaining independence while building mutually beneficial relationships with global powers. The failed operation had taught valuable lessons to all parties involved. For the Americans, it had highlighted the limitations of traditional covert action in a multipolar world where targets had access to sophisticated intelligence support and could turn failures into public relations victories. For the Russians, it had demonstrated the effectiveness of intelligence sharing and defensive cooperation as tools for expanding influence without the risks and costs associated with direct military intervention. For African leaders, it had shown that independence was possible but required careful planning, regional cooperation, and the ability to navigate complex international relationships without becoming dependent on any single external power. But perhaps the most important lesson was one that extended beyond the specific circumstances of Operation Sahel Storm. In an era of shifting global power dynamics, success would increasingly depend on understanding and adapting to change rather than trying to maintain outdated systems of dominance and control. Ibrahim Traoré had understood this lesson earlier than most, and his successful defense against American intervention had made him a symbol of African independence and self-determination. Whether this symbolism would translate into lasting positive change for his people and the broader region remained to be seen. But as he stood on the presidential palace balcony that evening, watching the lights of Ouagadougou twinkle in the darkness, Traoré felt cautiously optimistic about the future. The challenges were enormous, but for the first time in decades, African leaders had demonstrated that they could successfully resist external manipulation and chart their own course. The game was far from over, but the rules had fundamentally changed. And in that change lay both opportunity and hope for a continent that had endured too many years of external interference and internal instability. The story of Operation Sahel Storm would be studied by intelligence professionals, political scientists, and historians for generations to come. But its real significance lay not in the tactical details of the failed covert operation, but in what it represented about the changing nature of power and sovereignty in the 21st century. In the end, the operation designed to remove Ibrahim Traoré had instead elevated him to continental prominence and accelerated the very changes it was meant to prevent. It was a reminder that in the complex world of modern geopolitics, unintended consequences could be more significant than planned outcomes. The young military leader who had once stood alone on his balcony, contemplating the weight of leadership and the threats arrayed against him, had emerged from that crucible as a figure of historical significance. Whether that significance would ultimately prove positive or negative remained to be determined by future generations. But there was no doubt that Ibrahim Traoré had survived the storm and emerged stronger than ever. And in doing so, he had changed not just his own country, but the entire trajectory of African politics and international relations. The American operation to remove Traoré had failed completely, but its failure had taught lessons that would resonate far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. In a world where traditional forms of power were being challenged and redefined, success would belong to those who understood the new rules of the game. Ibrahim Traoré had proven that he was one of those leaders. The question now was whether others would learn from his example and what that might mean for the future of Africa and the world. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Africa. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.